Okay. Welcome, Mr. Gage. How's it going over there?
It's going super well, Mr. House, and good to see you. And I guess I'll be seen by 8-7, who am I missing like crazy?
That's right. And who's missing you? So why don't you start by as I told 8-7, I asked you what's a favorite nonfiction narrative book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the book you chose?
Sure. So it's this Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, who's a journalist. And I'd heard about the story. He's done a couple other amazing ones too. Into the Wild is one. And I just stumbled across it a number of years ago, and kind of in the cycle of reading, thought, oh, this is pretty cool story. And I found it riveting because it is a piece of nonfiction that reads like fiction because the story is so gripping. It's the kind of thing where you say, well, you can't make this stuff up. It's so real. So anyway, dove into it, read it a couple of years ago, and it was fantastic.
Okay. And what section what's going on if you want to maybe set the scene for the section that you're going to do the read aloud for today?
Sure. So John Krakauer, the author, actually went and climbed Everest. This is a set in 1996. It was the to date the greatest disaster on Everest, which hadn't yet happened yet. He went on and he actually made the summit, and he was just doing a piece on climbing Mount Everest. And while he was up there, I believe it was on his way back down, a storm hits, and it's a disastrous storm. So the part I'm going to read from is close-ish to the end. There's no spoiler because there were lots of deaths that happened when this hike happened. So I'm going to be reading a bit about dealing with some of the trauma that's happening, or some of the emergency stuff that's happening, so you get a real sense of the urgency of it all.
Okay. Are you ready to go? Are you set?
I am set. You're gonna have to excuse the Russian accent because there is a point where it's written like Russian, so I might lapse into that. But otherwise, I'm good.
Okay, I'm going to mute my mic then, Mr. Gage, and I'm going to let you go.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
You're
Talk to
welcome.
you at the end.
Okay. Okay, so I'm on page 250 of the book. Throughout April and early May, Rob Hall had expressed his concern that one or more of the less competent teams might blunder into a bad jam, compelling our group to rescue them, thereby ruining our summit bid. Now, ironically, it was Hall's expedition that was in grave trouble, and other teams were in the position of having to come to our aid. Without rancor, 3 such groups, Todd Burleson's Alpine Ascents International Expedition, Dave Brashear's IMAX Expedition, and Mal Duff's Commercial Expedition, immediately postponed their own summit plans in order to assist the stricken climbers. The rest of the IMAX team happened to be in Camp 2 at the time. Brashears immediately suspended filming in order to direct all of his expedition's resources toward the rescue effort. First, he relayed a message to me that some spare batteries were stashed in one of the IMAX tents on the call. By mid-afternoon, I'd found them, allowing Hall's team to reestablish radio contact with lower camps. Then Brashears offered his expedition's supply of oxygen, 50 canisters that had been laboriously carried to 26,000 feet to the ailing climbers and would-be rescuers on the call. Even though this threatened to put his $5.5 million film project in jeopardy, he made the crucial gas available without hesitation. Athens and Burleson arrived at Camp 4 in mid-morning, immediately began distributing IMAX gas bottles to those of us starved for oxygen, then waited to see what came of the Sherpas' efforts to rescue Hall, Fisher, and Gow. At 4:35 p.m., Burleson was standing outside the tents when he noticed someone walking slowly toward the camp with a peculiar stiff-kneed gait. "Hey, Pete," he called to Athens, "check this out. Somebody's coming into camp." The person's bare right hand, naked to the frigid wind and grotesquely frostbitten, was outstretched in a kind of odd frozen salute. Whoever it was reminded Athens of a mummy in a low-budget horror film. As the mummy lurched into camp, Burleson realized that it was none other than Beck Weathers, somehow risen from the dead. The previous night, huddling with Groom, Beetleman, Namba, and others of that group, Weathers had felt himself growing colder and colder. I'd lost my right glove. My face was freezing. My hands were freezing. I felt myself growing really numb, and then it got really hard to stay focused. And I finally just sort of slid off into oblivion. Through the rest of the night and most of the following day, Beck lay out on the ice, exposed to the merciless wind, cataleptic and barely alive. He has no recollection of Boucrive coming to Pittman, Fox, and Madsen, nor does he remember Hutchison finding him in the morning and chipping ice from his face. He remained comatose for more than 12 hours. Then, late Saturday afternoon, for some unknowable reason, a light went on in the reptilian core of Beck's inanimate brain, and he floated back to consciousness. Initially, I thought I was in a dream, Weathers recalls. When I first came to, I thought I was laying in bed. I didn't feel cold or uncomfortable. I sort of rolled onto my side, got my eyes open, and there was my right hand staring me in the face. Then I saw how badly frozen it was, and that helped me bring me around to reality. Finally, I woke up enough to recognize that I was in deep trouble and the cavalry wasn't coming, so I better do something about it myself. Although Beck was blind in his right eye and able to focus his left eye within a radius of only 3 or 4 feet, he started walking directly into the wind, deducing correctly that camp lay in that direction. Had he been mistaken, he would have stumbled immediately down the Kangshun face, the edge of which lay just 30 feet in the opposite direction. About 90 minutes later, he encountered some unnaturally smooth, bluish-looking rocks, which turned out to be the tents of Camp 4. Hutchison and I were in our tent monitoring a radio call from Rob Hall on the south summit when Burleson came rushing over. "Doctor, we need you bad," he yelled to Stewart from just outside the door. "Grab your stuff. Beck just walked in and he's in bad shape." Struck dumb by Beck's miraculous resurrection, an exhausted Hutchison crawled outside to answer the call. He, Athens, and Burleson placed Beck in an unoccupied tent, bundled him into 2 sleeping bags with several hot water bottles, and put an oxygen mask over his face. At that point, Hutchison confesses, none of us thought Beck was going to survive the night. I could barely detect his carotid pulse, which is the last pulse you lose before you die. He was critically ill, and even if he did live until morning, I couldn't imagine how we were going to get him down. By now, the 3 Sherpas who had gone up to rescue Scott Fisher and Makulu Gao were back in camp after bringing down Gao. They'd left Fisher on a ledge 27,200 feet after concluding that he was beyond saving. Having just seen Beck walk into camp after being given up for dead, however, Anatoly Boucrive was unwilling to write Fisher off. At 5 o'clock p.m., as the storm intensified, the Russian headed up alone to attempt to save him. "I find Scott at 7 o'clock. Maybe it is 7:30 or 8, says Boucrive. "By then it is dark. Storm is very strong. His oxygen mask is around face, but bottle is empty. He is not wearing mittens. Hands completely bare. Down suit is unzipped. Pulled off his shoulder. One arm is outside clothing. There is nothing I can do. Scott is dead." With a heavy heart, Boucrive lashed Fisher's backpack across his face as a shroud and left him on the ledge where he lay. Then he collected Scott's camera, ice axe, and favorite pocket knife, which Beetleman would later give to Scott's 9-year-old son in Seattle, and descended into the tempest. The gale that struck on Saturday evening was even more powerful than the other one that had lashed the call the night before. By the time Boucrive made it back down to Camp 4, the visibility was down to a few yards, and he almost failed to find the tents. Breathing bottled oxygen, thanks to the IMAX team, for the first time in 30 hours, I fell into a tortured, fitful sleep, despite the racket produced by the furiously flapping tent. Shortly after midnight, I was in the midst of a nightmare about Andy. He was falling down the lot's face, trailing a rope, demanding to know why I hadn't held on to the other end. When Hutchison shook me awake. "John," he shouted above the roar of the storm, "I'm concerned about the tent. Do you think it's going to be okay?" As I struggled groggily up from the depths of my troubled reverie like a drowning man rising to the ocean's surface, it took me a minute to notice why Stewart was so worried. The wind had flattened half our shelter, which rocked violently with each successive gust. Several of the poles were badly bent, and my headlamp revealed that 2 of the main seams were in imminent danger of being ripped asunder. Flurries of fine snow particles filled the air inside the tent, blanketing everything with frost. The wind was blowing harder than anything I'd ever experienced anywhere, even on the Patagonian ice cap, a place reputed to be the windiest on the planet. If the tent disintegrated before morning, we would be in grave trouble. Stewart and I gathered up our boots and all our clothing and then positioned ourselves on the windward side of the shelter. Bracing our backs and shoulders against the damaged poles, for the next 3 hours we leaned into the hurricane, despite our surpassing fatigue, holding up the battered nylon dome as if our lives depended on it. I kept imagining Rob up on the south summit at 28,700 feet. his oxygen gone, exposed to the full savagery of this storm with no shelter whatsoever. But it was so disturbing that I tried not to think about it. Just before dawn on Sunday, May 12th, Stuart's oxygen ran out. Without it, I could feel myself becoming really cold and hypothermic, he says. I began to lose feeling in my hands and feet. I worried that I was slipping over the edge, that I might not be able to get down from the call. And I worried that if I didn't get down that morning, I might never get down. Giving Stuart my oxygen bottle, I rooted around until I found another one with some gas left in it, and then we both began packing for the descent. When I ventured outside, I saw at least one of the unoccupied tents had blown completely off the call. Then I noticed Ang Dorje standing alone in the appalling wind, sobbing inconsolably over the loss of Rob. After the expedition, when I told his Canadian friend, Marion Boyd, about his grief, she explained that Ange sees his role on this earth as keeping people safe. He and I have talked about it a lot. It's all important for him in terms of his religion and preparing to go next round in life. Even though Rob was the expedition leader, Ange would see it as his responsibility to ensure the safety of Rob and Doug Hansen and the others. So when they died, he couldn't help but blame himself. In the absence of any other guides, I volunteered to fill that role and bring up the rear. As our despondent group filed slowly away from Camp 4 toward the Geneva Spur, I braced myself to make one last visit to Beck, who I assumed had died in the night. I located his tent, which had been blasted flat by the hurricane, and saw that both doors were wide open. When I peered inside, however, I was shocked to discover that Beck was still alive. He was lying on his back across the floor of the collapsed shelter, shivering convulsively. His face was hideously swollen. Splotches of deep, ink-black frostbite covered his nose and cheeks. The storm had blown both sleeping bags from his body, leaving him exposed to the sub-zero wind. And with his frozen hands, he'd been powerless to pull the bags back over himself or zip the tent closed. "Geez," he wailed when he saw me. His features twisted into a rictus of agony and desperation. "What's a guy have to do to get a little help around here?" He'd been screaming for help for 2 or 3 hours, but the storm had smothered his cries. Beck had awakened in the middle of the night to find that the storm had collapsed the tent and was blowing it apart. The wind was pressing the tent so hard against my face that I couldn't breathe. It would let up for a second, then come slamming back down into my face and chest, knocking the wind out of me. On top of everything else, my right arm was swelling up, and I had this stupid wristwatch on. So as my arm got bigger and bigger, the watch got tighter and tighter until it was cutting off most of the blood supply to my hand. But with my hands messed up so badly, there was no way I could get the damn thing off. I yelled for help, but nobody came. It was one long night. Man, I was glad to see your face when you stuck your head inside the door. Upon first finding Beck in the tent, I was so shocked by his hideous condition and by the unforgivable way that we let him down yet again, I nearly broke into tears. "Everything's going to be okay," I lied, choking back my sobs as I pulled the sleeping bags over him, zipped the tent doors shut, and tried to re-erect the damaged shelter. "Don't worry, pal. Everything's under control now." As soon as I made Beck as comfortable as possible, I got on the radio to Dr. Mackenzie at base camp. "Carolyn," I begged in a hysterical voice, "what should I do about Beck? He's still alive, but I don't think he can survive much longer. He's in really bad shape." "Try to remain calm, John," she replied. "You need to go down with Mike and the rest of the group. Where are Pete and Todd? Ask them to look after Beck and then start down." Frantic, I roused Athens and Burleson, who immediately rushed over to Beck's tent with a canteen of hot tea. As I hurried out of camp to rejoin my teammates, Athens was getting ready to inject 4 milligrams of dexamethasone into the dying Texan's thigh. These were praiseworthy gestures, but it was hard to imagine that they would do him much good. That's it.
Good. One question, Mr. Gage. Throughout, and that was more of it like action.
Yes.
Earlier in the book, how does Krakauer incorporate the research, either the history of climbing Everest or the science of the impact of altitude on the body, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, he goes quite a bit into the research of it. Like, he is in contact with different groups. There are two professionals who lead expeditions up. So he did research with them and told a lot of the history about the first, I believe it's been a couple years since I've read the whole book now, the first people to ascend the mountain, And then he goes into a fair bit of detail about the preparation. And then his own ascent up the mountain is fairly straightforward in terms of mishaps. They make it. And this point in the book that I read is actually them on their way back down when this unforeseen storm came. But yeah, he does a lot of talk about the preparation and a fair bit about the history of it.
Cool. All right. So everyone will hopefully, or not everyone, the people doing the narrative project will watch this on Tuesday, and then we'll get together 1 p.m. on Thursday. So yeah, chat about the projects that are going on, questions for you, maybe talk a little bit about your own Everest thing.
Sure.
Anything else you want to add before we sign off here?
No, not too much. I look forward to chatting.
Oh, come on. Come on.
What do I want to add? Do yoga, eat vegan, get some exercise.
Oh, I'm sorry I asked. Okay, Mr. Gage, thanks so much. I'm just going to stop recording 1 sec here.
Okay.